Welcome everyone. Yeah, prototypes. Woo! Yeah, good. Okay. My name is Frank Cifaldi. I'm the executive director of the Video Game History Foundation. More about me later. Actually, judging by my script, more about me right now. I want to start with my own story, becoming involved with prototypes. And it's really the story of how I got involved in game preservation. It's really what led to the Video Game History Foundation, ultimately. When I was a young person in the literal 1990s, I know I look much younger than that, right? But I discovered this magic technology that really enthused me. It was called emulation. It was the idea that my computer could pretend to be a Nintendo and play Nintendo games. This was just absolute magic to me. It's still magic to me. And so I got into this and started sort of this is the late 90s, rediscovering the games that I played when I was a kid, my NES games, stuff like that, and really kind of exploring the back catalog of these consoles and getting really interested, not only in the games themselves, but I got really interested in where these what we call ROMs, right? The games that were online came from. How do you get the data off of a cartridge, right? Who's doing this? Is there any organization to this? And so I actually got myself involved in what we today call game preservation, right? But what back then we called ROM dumping, right? Just finding the games and getting the data and putting them online. I helped in those days fill out some system libraries, the NES, the last couple NES games that just weren't online yet, just regular retail stuff. I kind of started tracking down, okay, what are the deeper cuts that are online? I discovered this whole weird, shadow industry of adult games in Taiwan, where you, play poker and people take their clothes off, and help to preserve some of that. But what really fascinated me about this whole scene of preserving game data was what we would call prototypes. And these were the two that were, super influential on me. So the one on the left is the original Earthbound for the 8-bit NES. I was familiar with Earthbound, the Super Nintendo game. I didn't know until I was exploring emulation that there was an entire game before that. Not only was there one before that, that it was this finished product that hadn't shipped, and that was just amazing to me. That the idea that an entire game, and a really good and interesting and historically relevant one, could just exist and not be put onto cartridge and sold to people. That was a new idea to young me. And then the one on the right, that's Sonic the Hedgehog 2, but specifically that's an early unfinished version of the game that had entire levels that didn't make it into the final. Sonic 2 was my game. I knew that game inside and out. And if this level, Hidden Palace Zone, was in that game, I would have seen it. But it's something that they cut out of the game. And I think in a lot of ways, I mean, this sounds so naive now, but I was young. I think this is what made me realize that humans make games. You know what I mean? This idea that there could be ideas that don't quite work, that get scrapped, that real labor goes into things. Sometimes things work, sometimes things don't. So really enthused by the idea of prototypes back then. And prototypes, as I understood them, were equally fascinating. They were on these weird sort of label-less cartridges. This is the actual cartridge that the Earthbound ROM that's on the internet came from. There's a really great documentary about this, by the way, if anyone hasn't seen it. It's called Mother to Earth. Look it up. It's really, really good. But this is exciting stuff. I wanted to try all these crazy prototypes that were out there. But I learned at that time that there was sort of this nascent collector's market for prototype cartridges, and that these collectors sometimes wouldn't be cool with sharing that information on the internet, with putting that ROM on the internet, because they felt that the financial value of their collectible that they collected might be affected, right? So the feeling was, if I have this unreleased game and if the data's online, it's no longer a unique object, right? It has become financially devalued by being shared with people. I didn't like that. Neither did the groups of ROM dumping ruffians that I ran with at the time. And I think we kind of saw ourselves like this, right? I know this might be hard to understand, but in the analogy, I'm Superman in this situation. And the collectors, anyone guess? Lex Luthor, right? That's right, I heard Lex Luthor, that's right. Like collectors Lex Luthor, because they're bad. That was sort of the mindset we had at the time, me and the groups I ran in. And you know, we really wanted to preserve these prototypes. We saw collectors as the people who were keeping this from us, right? So we kind of doubled down on like, okay, let's focus on prototypes. Let's find prototypes. And so this prototype, not literally this prototype, I can't find a photo, but a Capcom prototype of Mega Man 3 showed up on eBay. And God, we had to have it, right? Like, oh my God, what could be on here, right? Like maybe there's like an entire level that didn't make it. Maybe there's like, I don't know, like Carrot Man as one of the robot masters, right? Like some weird like cut ideas. God, we gotta save this from Lex Luthor, right? So we decided to band together, we bid high, and we beat the collectors, and woo, got it, right? Like, we won that auction, all right? Are we clear on the analogy? Okay. Take that, Luthor. So we got the card, sent it to the appropriate hardware guys, got the ROM off of it, and man, we dove in. What was on there? What mysteries awaited us on the capital P prototype of Mega Man 3? Well, it turns out, you play the game, and if you beat Top Man, there's this color palette bug that happens on his helmet, and that's like literally it. That's literally the only difference. But my God, did we show them? Did we show Lex? We got him this time, right? Lex was fuming. So a few months ago, this video came across my feed. This is from a channel called Hard4 Games. Now, let me be crystal clear here. These seem like, okay guys, criticism I have for this video is not personal. These guys contribute very positively to the community. But I do have criticism, and I'm going to express that criticism, and we're all going to be okay with it because we're all adults here. You're not an adult, but most of us are adults here. And we understand that there's nuance in the world. We good? We good? Okay. Okay. So, as you can see from this thumbnail, this video says that this prototype was quote-unquote saved from WADA. And the whole thing just felt very familiar to me. It felt a lot like what we had done back in the day, but you know, the faces are a little bit different now. For those who don't know, WADA Games, I don't know if that's an acronym, I have no idea. They are a collectibles grading company, specifically for video games. And so the idea, for the most part, is you send them your collectible game, like something in a shrink wrap, and they sort of put like a numerical score on it to say like what kind of condition it's in, mostly for resale value. They also authenticate prototypes, and that's what they do. So as the video progresses, the commentary around this event of, and we should say like shattering the case and getting the card out, seems to center around the idea that dumping a ROM from a prototype cartridge is somehow hurting the company that was paid money to put it in acrylic. I don't really understand that logic, but all right. At one point in the video, the gentleman in the middle here takes a sip from the drink that they made to celebrate this occasion and says it tastes like WADA tears. I guess they imagine something like this. I don't know. That, like, I'm not really sure I follow this logic, but anyway, the ROM was dumped, and they proceed to play the game in this video looking for differences, and they don't find any. So they put the ROM online, preserving it for future generations to explore. Yay, good, we saved the day, right? And it is online. It's on this is a wiki that actually looks for differences in things like prototype games, and it's there for people to explore. No one's found anything yet. Maybe they will. Maybe there'll be a Top Man color palette bug situation or something even cooler. We don't know. I'm not saying there's anything wrong here. Again, I'm not throwing shade at Hard4 Games. I'm really not. But what the video showed me is that while my thinking on prototypes has evolved over the last quarter of a century, I think that for a lot of the people sort of entering the preservation community that I consider myself a part of, I think that thinking has kind of stayed the same. I think it's been kind of stagnant, and I think that at least is in part because I don't really talk about this stuff. I've never really like talked about how my thoughts have evolved on this. So I guess that's why we're here today, right? We're here to listen to me talk about these thoughts. So let's demystify these things. Let's talk about prototypes. What qualifies me for this? Well, as you know, I've been preserving prototypes in some way or another for about 25 years. I've been going to classic gaming conventions since Classic Gaming Expo 1 in 1999. I started a website called Lost Levels. It was the first lost media community that I know of on the internet in 2003. I used to work in the media, so I got prototypes sent to me in the mail. I also made video games, sometimes made my own prototypes that went nowhere or were buggy or boring. I have preserved literally thousands, and that is not an exaggeration. I've handled thousands, plural, of prototypes in my life. I actually do some authentication work for companies, including WADA. Well, as you know from the first slide, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit archive of video game history called Video Game History Foundation. We've got a lot of prototypes in our archive. I know my stuff. We all good? Yeah? Caught up? Great. Let's just start with the basics, okay? So prototype in like the game development world is kind of like a gameplay rough draft, right? Like a first pass. There's a really good example that Miyamoto said, I think in an Iwata Asks interview, that the original prototype for the original Super Mario Brothers was they drew a box, they made it big, and they made it jump, right? And like the prototype of Super Mario Brothers was, does a big thing that jumps feel good? You know, like that's what like a prototype is. Like just, you know, like a basic conveyance of the idea is a prototype in the development world. In the kind of world we're talking about, the collector/preservation world, that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about things like this. So the earliest use of the etymology I know of it's actually within the video game enthusiast press, right? The early video game magazines. Here the word prototype was used to refer to cartridges they kind of got in the mail before the game was ready to be made in a factory, right? Like the company, like in this case, you know, Atari on the left, they wanted a magazine to be able to review Pac-Man, but it wasn't like completed yet. And they needed to get a copy to the magazine early because back at that time, if you wanted the review of Pac-Man to be on store shelves when Pac-Man was out, you needed to play it 3 months ahead of time. So they would have to, before they had done the full glossy color label and everything, they'd have to sort of make a temporary cartridge that worked. This is not unique to video games, by the way. Movie critics also got advanced screeners of movies, they're called. They're still sent on DVDs, can you believe that? Like not even Blu-ray, like literally DVDs are sent to like judges still, which is crazy. So cartridges like these were usually assembled by like a lab tech at a game company. As opposed to like the actual author of the game or anything like that. Like it was fairly specialized skill to be able to like solder chips onto boards and transfer data and things like that. So-called prototypes remained largely the same throughout the 80s and through the end of what we might call the 16-bit era. Things shifted a little bit in the optical disc days, like PlayStation, stuff like that, but we'll get to that. So these chips, these are rewritable ROM chips. These are EPROMs are what they're called. A ROM that's on like a game that you bought in a store is not rewritable. It's just a one-time stamp that happens in a factory. You can't do anything with it except play it, right? But an EPROM is something that you can erase and rewrite. And I say that because the first thing that I want people to understand is that if you have a physical prototype game, like the kind of thing we were just talking about, these were made for temporary use. These were made with reusable parts because these were expensive. Like the parts are expensive. A manufactured cartridge, like from a factory, like if you're ordering in the thousands, might cost you like $5 each, right? But if you are like, I mean, like this one on the upper right, for example, that's like a Sega prototyping board. I think Sega charged like $150, $200, something like that, if you were a developer to have that board. So you couldn't just afford to make a ton of these and send them out. You made them to be reused. That's why often actually like magazines didn't have this like cool archive of prototypes because the companies would be like, hey, you done? we need that back. I need to put Booger Man on there. So lesson 2, prototypes were expensive to make, so they were made selectively. They didn't make a ton of them. And when they did, you know, they either they were being sent to someone where, you know, like it's a buyer at Walmart or something, it's like it's worth sacrificing the $200 board because it's going to order 1 million copies, right? Or they were sending it to like a magazine, they're like, hey, give my stuff back. Some use cases for prototypes, isn't all. And I think it's important to make a distinction between something used internally by people making a product, making the game, and something that was used outside of that environment, right? So internally, you might make a prototype if you're just testing for bugs, right? It's like, okay, here's the latest version, see if it's still broken, right? Or I've personally handled things that were made for focus groups. If you've ever followed our work at the foundation, we did something on SimCity for the NES, which never came out, the 8-bit version. But the version that we have, we're pretty sure was used for a focus test, which is when basically Nintendo would like, you know, put out ads in the paper and get like kids to come play the game to give feedback, right? Maybe they didn't like SimCity, maybe that's why it didn't come out. You might use it for like internal evaluation, right? It's like, hey boss, latest builds here, how's the game progressing? You still feeling good about it, right? Or, you know, I've actually handled some of these too. People might just burn personal copies. Like sometimes when a game was done, the programmer of that game, knowing how to solder things, how to burn ROMs, might just make their own copy and take it home. Sometimes that game doesn't come out. But external uses, like I said, media coverage, kind of mentioned store buyers is a really common use case we don't hear about too often, but like you would send prototypes out to like store buyers to be like, hey, how many of these do you want to order, right? Or manufacturing submission, which we'll get to, but like this is like, okay, Nintendo, we're done. We good? Like we good here? You didn't find any like hidden blood or anything? Great. Looking at these external use cases, right? Like just following the logic. And I think this is a hard thing for a lot of people, especially like me in the 90s, think like fascinating about crazy Mega Man stuff, right? Now, an external prototype is meant to represent a finished product, right? Like this is like if something is being committed to an expensive piece of hardware and mailed to someone, it's meant to look good, right? Like it is not meant to be broken or weird or interesting. It is meant to represent the idea of the final game. And so if it's mailed out to someone, it's supposed to be done, right? Or at least like representative of that. I think a lot of the folks in preservation community kind of have this idea that like if a prototype is online, right? Like if a prototype's available to people to buy or whatever, or like a collector house, it's like, oh my God, that's the prototype. That's the one where they had the weird old ideas. But like for the most part, they're finished games. You just never see a rough draft version of a game made. Okay, there's exceptions. Like we all agree there's nuance in the world, right? Like we're good. Like there are exceptions. I think we actually, as a community, got a little bit spoiled by Sonic 2 being online, and I think this warped a lot of people, including me at the time, into thinking that like, wow, prototypes are weird. That Sonic 2 was a mess, man. Like the development of Sonic 2 was actually, like, historically we know was a weird mess that happened. And it's a miracle that it came out at all. But again, I think that this game in particular kind of warped perception for a lot of people. And I will point to the wiki for prototype games, which is literally called Hidden Palace, the name of that level. And if you look at Hidden Palace in any depth, you'll see that prototypes of this era, this sort of 8 and 16-bit era, is either literally exactly a copy of what was put in the retail game, or it's like something like Mega Man 3, right? Where it's like the differences are so minuscule that you kind of have to go at it with a microscope to figure it out. And if that's your jam, God bless you. Like, I love you, please continue doing that. But I think for most of the world, that's not super compelling stuff. Obvious exception, of course, is that sometimes a game just doesn't come out, right? Like we talked about earlier, this is a Daredevil game for PS2 that Hidden Palace recently put out. That's actually true. Like there are weird rough draft, like Resident Evil 1.5 for sure. Of course, you would talk about a PlayStation game. So this is, the most exciting part of the prototype world. This is kind of what I tend to focus my attention on, and this might be obvious, but I think unreleased games are always worth attention. So, something I want to talk about also, another lesson. What are you doing? So, an unreleased game isn't necessarily canceled because it's bad. So, something that I learned with Earthbound when we talked about its supposed cancellation with the producer of the game, Phil Sandhoff is his name. We talked to him for our Lost Levels website. We interviewed him, and we asked him, "Hey, why was Earthbound canceled?" And he said it wasn't canceled. It just didn't come out. It's like, what do you mean? These are the same, you're pointing at the same picture, right? And he's like, no, it was done. We were done. We just didn't manufacture it. And like that kind of blew my mind. It's like I didn't understand that concept at the time. It was like, oh, you could finish something and you could just kind of put it in the queue and be like, when it's ready, hit the switch and we'll start manufacturing them. And they just never got to that point. That happens a lot of times. There's actually a lot of reasons for a game not to come out. This is just ones I could think of this morning. But really, it comes down to two things. Either the publisher of the game literally couldn't sell it to you, or they just didn't think they could make money if they did. And those are the only two reasons the game a finished, I should say, game doesn't come out, right? Could be a lot of reasons for this. I'm not going to do the thing where I read everything on the slide. I think most of you are capable of reading this. But it's either just couldn't or too risky. So my point here is that an unreleased game could actually be a really valid game, right? And something worth studying, worth playing, worth looking at. And especially if it's something like, again, like the guy at Walmart was like, I don't get it, right? And I think, trusting the review abilities of the Walmart buyer versus circa 1994, he might not have a good insight into what we would value 30 years later. Anyway, moving on with our history lesson. We've mostly been talking about ROMs, but there was a switch that happened when the industry shifted to optical discs, which was huge. Suddenly developers, not only did they have 200 times more room for ROM data for their games, manufacturing got way cheaper too, because discs just cost nothing. So this all sounds great on paper, except that it meant that games started costing way more to make because they had to fill those discs, and that's a problem that continues to this day. But that's a different talk. In terms of prototypes, this shifted things quite a bit. So again, ROM cards were super expensive, had to be reused. They were bulky, so no one kept them, and they required specialized skills, right? You had to be able to solder and burn EEPROM, stuff like that. CDRs, man, the junior PR person could double click a batch file and burn a disk to mail to a magazine, and that's the thing that especially in the early era of CD games, they actually do get a little bit interesting around this era. There's sort of this perfect storm in sort of the PS1 era for weird nonsense, where discs were super cheap. Everyone's like, oh my god, we could just burn infinite discs. But also, most people didn't have the ability to pirate the game, so they weren't worried. So, I swear I've handled 8 different builds of Spider-Man and Tony Hawk and stuff like that, and they get kind of funky. They're actually super interesting. So that's my one exception. I think if you're looking for weird broken stuff, PS1 is your system. So after this, things calm down. PS1 era, like I said, Wild West. It starts to settle down when people start being able to burn discs at home, which wasn't true at the beginning. So Dreamcast, GameCube, and Wii, if you're collecting those, those were proprietary. They were a little bit more expensive again to burn. You don't see as many of those. PS2 through the 360 era, they're basically finished games for the most part. But the one exception I will say is that once in a while, a developer would put together a demo for a trade show like E3, and sometimes that demo would get sent to the magazines, and that could be really interesting. a really, really good example is, you guys know Shadow of the Colossus, that PS2 game? Like, yeah, the E3 demo is what was put on like the magazine demo disc, and like it's super interesting actually if you're into that game. Past that, like PS4, Xbox One, come on, we download games now, right? Like, so like the idea of prototype games starts to dwindle. Basically non-existent in the modern era. I think the only time I've seen a like physical prototype for the last couple gens of consoles has been like to test the manufacturing, you know, and it's like by the time you're there, you're like done. So that's our history lesson. That's up to now. So what is the state of things now in terms of prototypes? I find that there are, in general, there are two types of people who are interested in prototype games. There's those who value them as physical, collectible objects, and there are those who are preservation-minded who value sort of the data meat that's inside of them. Sometimes those groups intersect. They often do. Sometimes they don't. I myself fall into the latter camp. I'm not really a collector myself of physical objects, but I mean, I literally run something called the Video Game History Foundation. I almost got the name wrong. Like I'm clearly interested in historical video games, right? So let's talk about both of these groups. Neither superhero nor villain, they're just people. So let's talk about collectors first, right? Why do collectors collect prototypes? Often they sort of value what they perceive as that item's provenance, right? I think a lot of people have this romantic idea that, like, you know, Miyamoto like personally signed his author's copy and kissed it or something, but like, I really think these are mostly like lab techs are sent a floppy disk and they just burn the thing. But I think there's a mystique to being like, wow, this thing's behind the scenes, I'm not supposed to have this. Something that I also fall for sometimes. They sometimes value the item's unique qualities. Unreleased game, of course, is like, wow, I'm not supposed to have this, right? Collectors sometimes like prototypes that they just look interesting visually, right? They have like, people love if there's like a photocopy of the label on it. You know, it's like, wow, it looks like the retail game, but different. Sometimes they like the game itself. Like it might be a favorite from their childhood. Maybe it's a famous game, right? It's like, oh, I like Contra rules, and this is a Contra prototype. I want it for that reason. Sometimes they just collect that character. I don't know if my friend Josh is in this room, but he just really likes 7-Up, so he collects spot games. I think that's neat. Or they consider it a financial investment, right? But I think a lot of people in the preservation community think that number 4 is number 1, but it's not. It's a pretty rare thing. And if you are a financial investor, I don't recommend prototypes. But if you are, you're the ones that are worth money. I didn't know that was the next slide. So these are the ones that tend to be worth money. Again, prototypes of famous games. Like if a prototype of Super Mario Brothers comes up for auction, even if it's literally the final data on the cartridge, that thing's worth a lot of money, right? Also, again, unreleased games, always the exception. And this third category I've never considered, but it's true. If it's a prototype of a game that is in its retail form hard to find or expensive, that prototype is now expensive. I recently got contacted by someone who found a prototype, it looks real to me, of a Game Boy game called Amazing Tater, a game of just zero historical value, just a nothing game. It's fine, it's a Natsume thing. But the retail game, Amazing Tater, is like one of the most valuable games on the system, maybe the most valuable. Therefore, he's gotten like thousands of dollars in offers for the prototype version. So that's something that collectors tend to graft onto when it comes to that stuff. So again, prototypes are worth money, and of course that means sometimes money and preservation are at odds, like we talked about. And look, friends, this applies to all things in life, from dinosaur bones to that Jerry Lewis clown movie. And I think that's what that Hard 4 Games with video was trying to convey in their way. Private collectors versus historical preservationists, right? That these things are at odds. But here's the first of my 2 red hot takes. We ready? We got our like Southern Belle fans. I think these 2 groups have a lot in common, actually. I think collectors buy prototypes because they collect video games like they collect baseball cards, right? It's like, I collect NES games. oh, I've collected all the NES games. I'm out of NES games to buy. What more can I buy, right? And I think they collect prototypes because they just really like buying NES games and they want more. And I think preservationists, honestly, a lot of them do the same thing. We've dumped all the ROMs of all the NES games. What else is there to dump? There must be more to dump. Oh, we got to focus on these prototypes. We have to keep adding to the set, right? I think that humans are wired to not like when things are done. You know, like I think we want things to just happen forever, right? But here's the hotter of two takes, okay? I think data puts these groups at odds, but I don't think either actually cares about the data for the most part. There's of course exceptions. I don't think collectors really value the data that's on there, really, right? Like I think that a lot of collecting, like financially with prototypes, tends to be like, oh, this is a weird variant of a game I care about, right? Or oh, this is a cool object that I like. I think that it's like kind of a nice bonus if like, you know, the title screen has a different copyright date or something. I think that like adds to their perceived value, but I don't think that's the primary motivator for a collector. Similarly, I think that in the preservation community, the primary focus isn't really about the specific data on the cartridge, just that there is new data to put on the internet. I think that tends to be the driving factor, and that, you know, that data often really, I think that they're kind of waiting for someone to come around to look at it, and that they don't really like value it themselves, and I can demonstrate this. Here's Top Man. That's actually where I got the thing from. This is a screen cap of a YouTube video from 2020. Again, we dumped this in like '99, right? So it took like 20 plus years for someone to actually play through it, right? And try to look for differences. And by the way, just that part that I highlighted, right? They're so little different, you'd wonder if it was legit. That's why we're having this talk, right? Because like that seems to convey a thought process that like, well, if it's a prototype, it's got to be crazy, right? Like, no, it's a done game. But again, like basically no one's looked at it in all this time. I suspect the same thing is going to happen here. And I can demonstrate that. So that ROM is online. It is on the Hidden Palace website. The complete documentation for it says a prototype of Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back for NES. That's as far as it's gotten documented. Waiting for an enthusiast to come along any day now with that microscope and reveal all the secrets that are in this ROM that we don't know yet. But they're not going to, and I know this. Why do I know this? Because I also dumped a prototype of The Empire Strikes Back for the NES way back in 2009, and literally no one's looked at it. Like, it's just not a thing that people do. So, I guess if I have a point here, it's if your goal is to collect more data for data's sake, to add to the pile, for the theoretical Sherlock Holmes to look at, honestly, thank you, that's great, have fun, right? Like, I think that's awesome. You are contributing to video game history. You are preserving game history, and I applaud you for it, you rule. But, like, if your goal specifically is to be the most effective you can be at preserving video game history, I don't think this is it. It just reminds me of like the old the metaphor, right? Of like the dog finally like catching up to the car and biting and being like, well, what do I do now? What do I do with this? I have the data. What do we do with it? And I just think there's way more. Okay, if you actually care about The Empire Strikes Back on the NES, I don't. But like if you do. And if you want to preserve the history of that game, there are so many things you could do that are way more interesting than going to Virtual Vegas and rolling the dice on Prototype and like assuming that we're going to learn something about the creation of this game. I would say that like instead of making a performative video about sticking it to the man, why don't you call the guys who made the game and ask them how they did it, right? Like I think that would be a way more effective way of preserving the history of this game. You can do all kinds of stuff. Again, I don't want to read the whole thing, but like there's so many, if you have different skills, different interests, you can preserve games in your own way and document those things online. If you are into music, like transcribe the music so that people can start like breaking it down, right? If you're just kind of good at Photoshop, like make a sprite sheet, put it online so that people can like study the graphics without having to play it. You know, talk to the developers, maybe reverse engineer the game, et cetera, like scan things. Like it's really simple, but like, if you've never played the game before, load it up, hit record, put it on YouTube or archive.org or something, and just say, like, first time playing the game. I think there's historical need to know what a game looks like the first time someone plays it. I think that's valuable to someone who's a video game historian. Or if you're really good at the game, show people how it's done, right? Like, all of these are way more effective, I think, than dumping a prototype that was probably just a final submission copy to Nintendo, and hoping that something cool comes out of it. Okay, similarly, if your goal is to collect physical prototypes, good for you. God bless, have fun. But I think you should consider what your responsibilities are and where your priorities lie. If you have something that is of interest to people who share the same passion as you do for video game history, and you're worried about money of all things, like, I get if you're low income and you have something that could change your life, right? But if it's something that's not actually going to make a huge dent in your life in exchange for, like, adding to the historical record of video games, I think you should need to consider where your priorities lie, right? I think you do have a responsibility, especially if you have an unreleased game that you're just sitting on waiting to be rewarded for or something like that, right? Just consider that. And again, I don't think it's like this, right? I think that we're all humans, and I think that if we actually maybe communicated with each other a little bit more and expressed our common interests to each other and figured out how we can navigate this world together, then maybe Lex and Superman could, I don't think painting people as cartoon villains in any situation helps anything. I think the othering of groups that you don't belong to is at best a waste of time, but at worst is a slippery slope to some really bad stuff. So if you find yourself in either camp, that you think the other side is a cartoon villain, just consider not having that perspective on life and then being a better person, man. That's really all I got. Thank you, everyone, so much. I don't know, how long do I have for questions? Do I have 20 minutes or do I have a full hour?
You've got 3.
3 minutes?
Wait, let me double check that it didn't change.
42?
But usually they're going until the quarter hour.
Quarter hour, so I have 5 minutes for questions. Anyway, anyone have questions? Okay, blue shirt, yes.
So where would you say digital games kind of fall under this? For example, would a game being released through like early access on Steam kind of fall under that prototype umbrella? Or would it have to, or is it a completely different thing and it's more for when like that digital game finally gets a physical release or something like that?
That's a really good question. So the question was, how does this apply, this sort of etymology for prototype games apply to things like digital games, especially things that have early access, right, where unfinished versions are available to the public. I don't want to be the godfather determiner of these things, but what the community has shown me, like the Hidden Palace wiki, for example, has shown me is that early access games are, at least from people who sort of observe what we'd call prototype games, they tend to consider early access builds and unfinished builds as part of that same canon. And it makes sense to me because there's no other place that a unfinished game comes from these days. That includes magazines. Magazines are sent final code these days. Well, magazines. There's no magazines anymore, just websites or whatever. Yes, up front.
What would you consider, would you sometimes consider demos on like demo discs in the PS1 and the PS2 days to be like prototypes?
Yeah.
I know specifically with the Net Eurose console of the PS1, they would release some of those Net Eurose games onto demo discs, and those people went on to then work at Sony. And there's a specific example I can think of where you can play this Net Eurose game on a demo disc and you're literally playing Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, and it's almost the same model.
So the question was, on demo discs, magazine demo discs, for example, like where did this sort of fall into the prototype thing? I touched on this a little bit earlier, but a lot of times the versions of games that would be sent to magazines for demo discs were unfinished versions. And a lot of times, those unfinished versions were things that were made for like demonstration at trade shows and stuff like that. And again, the community has shown that those are kind of considered prototypes. They're considered unfinished versions that people data mine and look at for this kind of research. Anyone else? Yes, the black mask. Yes, yeah.
How are things with preservation of older PC games and that sort of thing? Are they like distribution via floppy disks and then later on with CD burning and that sort of thing?
So is the question like within the sort of history of like prototypes and how they were distributed and stuff, where did PC games lie? Was that sort of the question? Okay, gotcha. We don't see a lot of those, unfortunately, but like in the floppy disk days, it was very similar. You'd get floppy disks in the mail with like a preview version of a game. I worked at oneup.com for a spell. For a spell came out of my mouth for the first time. We were in the same office that Computer Gaming World was in when that was a thing, and they still had some of the review games around. And they tended to just be, especially in the optical disc days, kind of the same thing. They'd burn discs, send them off. Floppies. I guess the difference might be that the floppies they didn't ask for them back because there was floppy disks. They weren't that expensive, but I don't tend to see like floppy disk preview code very often. I don't know why those didn't survive. I think that they just weren't taken home or something like that. God, so many. Oh, all the way in the back. Yeah, yes.
Hi, Frank.
Oh, hi, Heidi. Sorry, far away.
So, do you find that there's a cultural difference in different territories for like dumping unreleased stuff? Like, I hear Japan in general tends to hoard things, not necessarily for profit, but for cultural reasons.
Yeah, exactly. So the question was, is there a cultural difference in whether people preserve code from prototypes? And Heidi's example was Japan, which is the one I know the best. And yeah, there absolutely is. I don't understand all the nuance there, but my understanding is that Japanese culture tends to skew more toward like respect for author than like Western culture, and that tends to manifest itself in this world through people like basically having a belief that having that data that is not supposed to be available be made available is disrespectful. And I think that in the West we don't tend to have that view as much, for better or worse. I think somewhere in the middle is probably where my moral line is, but yeah, there is a very clear cultural difference, and it's one that took me a few years to respect and work around as opposed to like rage against. Probably one more. Yeah, white face mask, purple shirt.
Are there any like records of any prototypes being publicly available because of, like corporate espionage or like any
The GigaLeaks.
Yeah. So the question is, are there examples of prototype games being made available through something like corporate espionage? The light version of that is there's many examples of people just taking stuff home, and that's technically theft. I wouldn't call that espionage. It's mostly like I just packed what was at my desk and left, right? But in terms of like things that, yeah, like sort of leaky stuff. I mean, like someone said the GigaLeaks. That was that big leak that happened a few years ago of Nintendo data. There were a few prototypes in there, now that I think about it. It tends to. I don't like when it happens with like current things. Like there was like Grand Theft Auto leak. There was that Insomniac leak. Like don't do that, man. Like just wait for the game. But I can't think of too many other examples. Like most preservation happens from things that just people keeping stuff that they shouldn't have kept. But luckily, like when it comes to older stuff, time tends to forgive these things. But in terms of juicy espionage stories, that's kind of all I've got. Listen, if you guys don't know, the Video Game History Foundation runs the Video Game Museum at the show. We are in D135 and 136. That's where I will be headed right after this. Please come hang out and get a picture at the Game Boy Camera photo booth and talk to me. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and here are a few more videos for you to check out.